When I was 21, I thought I knew what safe looked like because I had grown up with narrow routines and wide porches in a neighborhood where people left bikes on lawns and trusted their neighbors enough to borrow sugar without a second thought. I moved into a small second-floor apartment on Maple Street after college, a place with a creaky wooden stair, a screen door that always stuck on humid nights, and a single large window that faced a strip of trees and a quiet parking lane. For months, the nights smelled of cut grass and motor oil. My routine was simple and comforting. I cooked frozen dinners on Fridays, my friend Sarah dropped by with cheap wine on Saturdays, and I left the porch light on because the landlord, Mark, said it made the building look lived in. I remember exactly the little things because those details became anchors later. The dent in the refrigerator door from when my roommate Jenna had moved out, the coffee mug with a chipped rim that I kept on the counter, the sound of my neighbor Tom coming home late from the bakery where he worked and dropping a bag of unsold rolls with a soft thump. I was not expecting danger to look like ordinary sounds. The first time something odd happened, it started so small that I almost dismissed it. It was a Sunday. I had been home alone, playing a video game and eating pizza from a place around the corner called Russo Pizza, the box still steaming on the table, the sauce tang clinging to my fingers. The delivery guy, a man with a delivery bag and a cheap baseball cap, had smiled when I opened the door. "You alone?" he asked, glancing past me into the dim hallway. I froze. I lied and said my roommate was out back, that someone was coming, and took my change, $5.88, counted out loud to sound normal. He replied, "Okay then," and left. That question lodged in my chest like a tiny stone, an obvious but chilling intrusion. Later, I told my friend Mike about it over the phone, voice low, and he laughed it off, then stopped when I described the way the man had looked past me and not at me, like he was checking for another presence. The night seemed to press in after that, so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycle like a distant engine. Around 11:30, I heard the screen door tap, light and tentative, then again, sharper, a knock at the main door that was not the delivery knock and not anyone I knew. "Hello?" a voice said, muffled through glass. I crept to the window, felt the cool paint under my fingertips, saw the shadow of a person shifting under the sodium lamp, a silhouette that could have been a coat or a man, and felt the air in my lungs go thin. I dialed Jenna slowly because I did not want to make the sound of panic on the line, and said, "Someone is at the door." And she whispered back, "Call Mark." And I did. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs that did not belong to my neighbor Tom. The doorbell rang again, and this time the rhythm was a staccato, and the wood of the door seemed to vibrate. I answered, because part of me was furious at the interruption, and part of me was terrified, and the voice at the door said, "You sure you are alone?" in the same flat tone as the delivery man. I stepped back and said, "Please leave," and he laughed, softly, almost a soundless puff, and I told him I was calling the police, which I eventually did. Officer Ruiz arrived with lights clicking low, his uniform smudged from rain, and he walked the perimeter of the building with a flashlight that left strips of white through the dark. He asked me to describe the man, and I described the cap, the cheap jacket, the way he had looked past me, and Officer Ruiz took notes and promised he and another officer would patrol the block. He left with a polite, "We will keep an eye," that sounded like both reassurance and uncertainty. In the morning, I found smudges on the windowsill, fingerprints that were greasy and small, and the capital M scratched lightly in the paint where nothing should have been written. That night, the sense of safety I had rationalized away evaporated. I started double-locking everything and sleeping with a chair wedged under the doorknob because the police had said there was not enough evidence to hold anyone, and because Mark told me to be careful, but also to calm down. I did not recognize the way my apartment felt to me anymore. The house noises that used to be comforting became potential signals, the tap of a heel, the rustle of a jacket, the soft ludge of the gutter. I told Sarah and Mike and Jenna, and they each had a theory. Mike said it was a drifter. Sarah said it could be someone who had been following me. Jenna said maybe it was a mistake.
Each time they spoke, I listened for whatever ordinary detail would prove that I was overreacting. I was not. It could have ended there, with a scare and a lesson, but the second incident made it clear that the first was not a fluke. A few weeks later, I took a job that required late shifts, and the nights became lonelier. One Tuesday, I stayed later than expected at work and came home in the deep hum of a city that was quieter after midnight. The hallway smelled like bleach and lingering coffee, the fluorescent bulbs buzzed, and when I stepped into my apartment, I noticed the living room light had been left on, which I had not done. My skin prickled.
I called out, "Hello?" and there was no answer, only the clink of a spoon in the sink. I remember that moment because I felt the carpet under my bare feet and the softness of the rug, and I knew that this house had simple comforts and small betrayals. I walked carefully, the soles of my feet soft against the rug, and stopped at the kitchen door, where a faint scent of smoke and cigarettes sat like a secret. On the counter, a note lay in someone else's handwriting, ink jagged and hurried. It said simply, "We watch," followed by a crude smiley face. I touched the paper, and it left an oil on my fingers the way fingers leave oil from handling a steering wheel. I called Officer Ruiz, who arrived with his partner Lisa, and sat at my kitchen table drinking lukewarm coffee and asking questions that felt at once professional and weary. "Did you see anyone?" Lisa asked. "No," I said. "Do you know anyone who would want to scare you?" Officer Ruiz asked. "No," I said again. They took the note, bagged it, and told me they would run prints if anything usable showed up. That night, I left every light burning and kept my phone under my pillow to screen a small blue pulse in the dark. At 2 in the morning, a shadow passed the window, like a slow exhale, and then a tapping began at the glass, gentle and methodical, that classic 333 that made my spine tighten. I moved to the window and saw a pale face pressed against the pane, eyes rimmed in red, smile slack and impossible, like something seen in a mirror warped by breath. I shouted at it to go away. I sounded ridiculous, desperate, and the face did not move. It tapped once more and then slipped into the tree line, as if it had never been there. I screamed to myself and called Jenna, who told me to come to her place, and I went, leaving the apartment door unlocked because my hands shook too much to manage keys. From Jenna's couch, we watched the street through her window and waited for nothing and everything. The police came and took reports and said they had found faint boot prints by the back alley and that the pattern was mixed with the tread of a child-sized shoe and something larger. They had no leads. The landlord, Mark, replaced the lock, and I felt a temporary protection that was paper-thin but useful. I reported everything to the apartment management, to a counselor named Linda that Mike recommended, and to my parents, who lived in another town and called me at odd hours with anxious questions. The name I heard most was paranoia, but I knew the feeling of being observed, and the way being watched changed how I moved through my own rooms. From then on, I never closed the curtains all the way. I bought a cheap motion sensor light for the balcony and set it to go off at the slightest twitch, and I started keeping a small pocket knife in the kitchen drawer under the spoons because Officer Ruiz had told me to have something to hand if I needed to protect myself. The knife felt heavy and domestic in my palm. At this point, I need to pause and say something directly to you because the thing I am asking you to do is simple and could help more than you know if you are part of this community of people who watch these stories. If you have ever been watched, if you have ever had a face at your window, reply in the comments starting with, "This happened to me," and tell us just your city so others can see patterns. Your words matter, and they help others know they are not alone. If you share, make your message short and concrete. Did you hear tapping? Did the person ask a question? Did the police show up? We read every single reply because patterns repeat, and sometimes one small detail points investigators to a larger picture. Now I will continue this with details that I have not shared publicly before, because that is what this story is for, to put the things in the open that made my nights smaller and my lock clicking louder. A few months later, my family decided enough was enough, and we arranged to spend a long weekend at a small rental house out of town owned by my Aunt Linda in a rural area that she said was safe and quiet. We packed the car with snacks, blankets, a dog crate for her terrier Molly who thumped her tail on long drives, and I told myself the change of scene would be a reset. We arrived as the light was soft and the house smelled of old wood and lemon oil. The new place was different from my apartment, spread out, with a long porch and windows that looked over a field and a line of trees. On the first night we built a fire and laughed at silly old movies while my father Dave told stories about hunting with his friends and my mother Sarah fretted over leaving the back door unlocked. The security there felt robust. The first time something weird happened at the rental, it was almost laughable if it had not been so uncanny. We sat eating s'mores, and I looked out toward the tree line and saw a man standing perfectly still beneath an oak, his face half hidden in shadow, hands folded in front of him. I called out, "Hey, are you lost?" because in that region people still wandered at odd hours and expected help. He did not answer at first, and then he walked a few steps forward and lifted a hand in a polite wave and said, "Hello," as if we had expected him. Father Dave stood up slowly, then sat back down again and said, "That is strange," and my Aunt Linda went pale. We invited him over, but he declined, saying he was just passing through, and that was that. We all broke the encounter into theories. My cousin Tom said he was probably a neighbor. My friend Mike said it was someone fishing or camping. But my mother kept watching him and noticed his shoes were clean despite the long grass, and his jacket smelled faintly of gasoline, which did not belong there. The man lingered for several evenings, showing up at dusk, sometimes to stand by the tree or to be just outside the field so that we could not hear his voice well. He never tried doors, but he watched windows. And once I found a small stone on the porch with a face drawn in ink and a tooth of what looked like a small animal tucked under it. We called the local sheriff, Elaine, who came in a county truck and talked in a low voice that suggested she had dealt with worse and better. "We will keep a patrol," she said. "No promises," she added, and those words sat like a cold plate on the table. The man never forced himself into the house, but on the last night he stood close to the glass of the bedroom window and tapped lightly, with 3 small knocks as I lay under heavy blankets pretending to sleep. The sound was a kid's game, methodical and almost musical, and then a soft scratching at the siding, like someone running a fingernail along the wood. I whispered, "Who is there?" and the tapping stopped. The next morning, the sheriff left a card on the front mat saying, "Report anything immediately." And the rental agency apologized and refunded our stay. After that episode, my parents said we would not travel there again. My father kept the idea of calling it an oddity, something from a drifter or a bored local, and yet the image of that face at the glass would follow me back into the city. I kept hearing the tapping in quiet rooms, and my hand would go to the window as if expecting to feel the glass yield beneath my palm. The third account happened after I moved out of Maple Street into a house with a small yard where my friend Jenna and I shared rent. We had sworn off living alone and wanted the company and the idea of safety in numbers. The house was older, with a sagging porch and a bay window that looked out onto a narrow street flanked by mature sycamores. Our neighbors were a mix of retirees and young couples. One night, a man banged on the bay window so hard that the panes rattled, slow and measured, a long, steady boom, boom, boom that left our dog Molly shaking and us staring at each other. Jenna whispered, "Go
See," and I wanted to, but also wanted not to move, because moving meant confronting whatever was out there. The man spoke through the glass at a volume that was strangely calm. "Open up," he said. "I need to come in." We called 911, and the operator told us a unit was dispatched. While we waited, we spoke in low voices, each exchange a small tether to sanity. "Do you see him?" Jenna asked. "Yes," I said. "What is he wearing?" she asked. "A dark coat and the hat," I answered. "Does he look like he is dangerous?" she asked. And I could only say, "I do not know," because the truth was that danger does not always have a face that matches the word. Officers arrived and shone flashlights that painted the man in harsh light. He stood back from the porch, hands raised like a surrender, only he was not surrendering. Officer Ruiz again, who had become my unofficial lifeline, spoke to him at length, and the man told a story about needing to use a phone, about being late to meet a friend, his voice soft and plausible. The officers searched the area and found no outstanding warrants. His ID was clean. He walked away after being escorted out of the immediate perimeter, and the officers left after saying, "Stay inside tonight." We slept badly. The next morning, Jenna found scratch marks on the inside trim of the bay window, as if someone had tried to widen a gap, and a thin line of dried mud that led from the gutter to where the man had stood. It looked almost like the pattern of bare feet. The landlord, a man named Eric, replaced the trim and made promises that felt practical and insufficient. We installed a small camera that recorded sound and left a note on the front door that said in blunt letters, "No solicitors." A week later, the camera captured a figure standing in the yard at 2 in the morning, peering into the bay window, then crouching, then reaching his hand to touch the glass, and pressing his face near the lens until the image blurred with condensation. We watched the footage in a bright kitchen, and the image made the air feel cold. We took the footage to Officer Ruiz, who said he would file a report. The man was never identified. The footage was leaked online by someone in the neighborhood who thought it was a prank, and the comments speculated wildly about motives, about mental illness, about voyeurism. The town council debated installing more streetlights. The councilman Dave talked in a public meeting with tired eyes and said, "We are doing what we can," which in local politics is a phrase that often hides limitations. We started sleeping with heavy curtains and chairs braced under doorknobs. I started imagining the night outside as a layered thing, with people walking in the distance and someone close to the glass studying the patterns of our lives. The fourth account was the one that felt the most organized and the most personal because it involved someone who learned my rhythms and my friends. I had a brief relationship with a man named Aaron during a summer that felt like a pause between bigger choices. He was quiet, amiable with a knack for fixing things, and he would often stand by my window on the porch and watch the street with a look that seemed reflective rather than intrusive. We broke up amicably after a few months, but stayed in touch because our social circles overlapped and because he knew my neighborhood. After we stopped dating, I noticed that small things shifted. He would text just as I was leaving for work and ask what time I would be home. He would sometimes be standing across the street when I returned from night shifts, his figure easy to miss but always there. Once I invited my friend Mike over for dinner, and Aaron knocked on the window during the meal, tapping the glass as if to get our attention, smiling. And when I opened the door, he said, "I was just walking by." But his hand held a bundle of the same roses he had given me before we split, and his tone was oddly possessive. I told him not to come around so much, and he accepted it, then came back 3 days later to apologize in person. That apology was where things turned from uncomfortable to threatening. He climbed the porch steps late at night, and when I asked him to leave, he whispered, "You left the window open," and pushed his way toward the bay. He smelled of old cologne and wet fur. We wrestled in the hall, and he left with a scraped knuckle and a promise to himself that he would come back calmer. He did. One night, he faced the window and spoke softly to himself, as if rehearsing lines he would later say out loud. He learned the rhythm of my friends arriving and leaving, the sound of Sarah's laugh that meant she had come in through the back, the way Jenna always took a call on the porch. He used those patterns to place himself at the right time and the right side of the glass, so that he would be seen but remain anonymous. Once he left a note under my door that said, "Remember what we were," and had my initials carved into the back of it. I called the police, and this time they took a different approach. Officer Ruiz with Officer Lisa and another detective sat in my living room and said that they would seek a restraining order and that they had jurisdiction because Aaron had left a note that could be construed as harassment. They also said they would monitor social media and phone records if I consented. We pressed charges, and the court set a date. Aaron came
to the courthouse in a suit that was limp and ill-fitting and told the judge in a soft voice that he meant no harm, that he only wanted to be near what he had loved. The judge issued a temporary protection order and warned him sternly, For a while, things calmed. He lived a few blocks away still, and the order kept him from approaching my home. But a month after the hearing, I woke to find a single small stone on my windowsill wrapped in a plastic bag, and inside the bag, a scrap of fabric with a thread pattern I recognized from a scarf I had forgotten at his apartment months earlier. The note inside said, "See you," and had been written in a hand that knew my name. That was the moment when legal protection met the unsettling practical reality that paper cannot stop a person who chooses to cross the line. I moved out the next week because the court could not guarantee my safety, and because I could feel him in my rooms in the way that a scent lingers after someone leaves. The prosecutor handled the case, but dropped it months later after Aaron moved away and the evidence was thin. The restraining order expired, and my phone sometimes lit with unknown numbers. And my neighbor Jenna would text at strange hours, telling me she had seen a figure at the corner. That feeling of being studied persisted. 1 month after the courthouse events, I slept with the lights on and kept the curtains closed. And I visited a counselor named Linda twice a week who taught me grounding techniques and how to rebuild a sense of home. 3 months later, I had changed my locks and moved to a different part of town. And I still found myself checking windows in passing cars, feeling the heat of that old vulnerability, as if a bruise had not yet healed. 6 months later, I was living in a small house with thick curtains and a motion sensor light that erupted like a sentinel whenever something moved. And I had developed a ritual of sweeping the sill and checking for stones or notes. I learned to leave lights on stormy nights and to keep a community network with friends who texted when someone suspicious lingered near a window. The practical changes were tangible. The police reports stacked in a neat folder, the smartphone footage labeled and backed up, a new lock with a chain, and the camera on the porch, all of it physical proof that something happened and that I had acted. But the quieter consequences were harder to document, and that is the real measure of loss. My sense of ease at night eroded. I noticed small hesitations before I opened doors, and the way my laughter thinned in rooms with too many glass surfaces. I found myself imagining faces outside windows when I should have been sleeping, and sometimes in the morning I would look at the panes and catch my own reflection and not be sure if I was the watcher or the watched. I started carrying this story as a kind of quiet scar that shaped choices. I did not let myself live alone for long stretches. I asked friends to come over when I had a late shift, and I never answered a knock at a window. If there is one thing I want you to take from these accounts, it is that patterns matter, and small details stitched together into larger threats. A question asked by a delivery person can mirror a question asked later by a stranger at your window. A tap 3 times at night might be meaningless on its own, but repeated taps across blocks can be a signal. If you ever find a strange object on your sill, if you hear tapping at the glass, if a person always seems to be where you are about to be, document it. Take a photo, call the police, tell a friend, and make a record. Report things even when the response is imperfect, because the record helps the next person. For me, the things I could show mattered in court, and sometimes they did not, and the things that remained intangible were the ones that took the longest to heal. At 1 month, I was jumpy in the dark and leaned toward friends to feel safe. At 3 months, I had replaced my locks and my habits, and the shape of my home started to look familiar again. At 6 months, I could walk down a street without checking windows constantly, and I could sit near a window and read without expecting to see a face pressed to the glass. The tape of footage stood in my drawer like a relic, and sometimes I would take it out and watch the frames where a face lingered and try to remember who I used to be before that face entered my nights. I joined a neighborhood group on social media, and we began to map incidents and share details so others could be aware. I still have boundaries to protect and rituals to maintain, and I still wake occasionally imagining a faint tap on the window like a memory that will not quite untether. The police were helpful at moments and fallible at others. Friends were essential, and sometimes the people who cared least were those who thought the stories were dramatic. If you lived through something like this, I want you to know your reaction is valid. If you have not experienced it yourself, look up from the screen and check on a neighbor, lock your windows, and listen.
Safety is not a state, it is a practice. If this story resonated and you want more verified accounts like this, consider subscribing so we can continue to collect and share experiences and help each other. And if you have a story of your own,
This happened to me, and name your city so others can see patterns and connect. Security is a feeling that can be rebuilt if we do it together, but sometimes the memory of a face at the glass never fully leaves, and the house you loved is never quite the same again.